As we study tonight's topics delivered by a range of presenters, let's pause for a few moments to remember the human side of a Gallipoli campaign, and in particular, our own brethren, the Australian gunner. In August 1914, the recruiting depots were filled overflowing with eager young recruits, ready to take up arms, travel to the other side of the world, and fight for a variety of reasons. These men came from all walks of life, from the wealthy to the dirt poor, and everywhere in between. They were university students, shearers, labourers, drovers and clerks. Luckily, there was also a sprinkling of the professional and semi-professional soldiers from the permanent army and the militia, and it fell upon these individuals to turn civilian into soldier. 25 April 1915, and the heavily laden landing boats cut away their tows and the troops took to the oars. Amongst the lead elements in the first wave were a number of forward observation parties. Their mission? To observe fire for the naval ships waiting offshore. These parties were commanded by a number of young officers who had recently graduated ahead of time from the Royal Military College, Duntroon. Lieutenants Close, Vowes and Goodwin were about to take their first steps into creating a legend. Others from the class held positions within the number of batteries who were awaiting to get in and get a crack at the enemy. One, Clarence Wolfendine, wouldn't make it off the peninsula. 19-year-old Sergeant Ron Cavalier had an interesting first day. He was a gun sergeant from 4 Battery, and about mid-afternoon on the 25th, he brought the first Australian gun ashore. On arrival at the Anzac Cove, he was ordered to reload the guns and return to the ship. Reluctantly carrying out his orders, the barge carrying the 2 guns had no sooner reached the vessel when they were ordered to return to Anzac with all speed. Sergeant Cavalier had his gun ashore by 17:30, and with the aid of about 100 infantrymen, they were able to manhandle the gun to the southernmost point. At 1800, he fired the first of 62 rounds, engaging a concealed gun far to the south. Ron Cavalier went on to survive Gallipoli. He deployed to France and Belgium, but not before he received a surprise visitor at his gun platform at Gallipoli, and that was his father, who did not inform Ron that he too had enlisted in the AIF. The next day, a number of guns were brought ashore. The first gun was a gun from each of the 1st and the 4th batteries. These were quickly dragged into position and into action. The detachment started to engage the enemy at a range of mere 400 yards. By the end of the day, firing over 800 rounds between them. Even more perilous was the fact that the guns were actually in the infantry's forward trenches and could have easily been overrun and captured if the Turks had counterattacked. The ammunition resupply proved demanding, as the rounds had to be carried by hand from a kilometre away, and the journey was made additionally difficult by troublesome Turkish snipers. "20-year-old Dorian King, a clerk from Kew, went without sleep for the first 4 days and 4 nights, moving ammunition by hand and, when available, by mule to the forward guns. But what the gunners needed was high explosive rounds instead of the shrapnel rounds that they were issued. The HE would not reach Gallipoli until June, and then only in a trickle. King was to survive Gallipoli and later, as a captain, earn a military cross on the Western Front. His personal diary, which is contained in the Australian War Memorial, is a feast of first-hand information and accounts of his time at Gallipoli. 14 guns in total were landed on the 26th, but the problem still existed: not enough suitable gun platforms or battery positions to accommodate the guns. 2 batteries Lieutenant Jeremiah Selms made it to shore with a section of 18-pounders, only to be bellowed at with, "Who told you to come in? Get the bloody hell out of here. There is no use for guns at present." Disgruntled, he returned to the ship with his men and his guns. As he stepped aboard, he was heard to mutter, "The bastards can't make their bloody minds up." Lieutenant Walter Urquhart was a gun position officer. He was also one of the graduates of a recent 1st Duntroon class holding RMC Staff Cadet number 1. His old commandant, General Bridges, would often tour the front and bump into his old charges. In May, He was visiting Urquhart when he's at his battery command post in Shrapnel Gully. Off to continue his tour, Bridges stepped out from the protection of the sandbags, where a Turkish sniper fired a single round, mortally wounding the general. In later years, Urquhart would often comment that he was the first staff cadet to arrive at Duntroon, and he was the first to see the commandant, and now he was the last to see him as he was carried away. Lieutenant Shirley Goodwin landed at Gallipoli. He was a forward observation officer, and he went days without sleep. His job to call in the naval gunfire support in a vain attempt to try and silence the well-deployed Turkish batteries. Recognising his talents, he was later reassigned to a new role, that of an airborne observer. On one of his first flights, his plane was forced down behind enemy lines. He was captured uninjured and suffered the hell of a Turkish prison camp. Plagued with multiple bouts of malaria and a range of other diseases, he was a former shadow of himself when he was released 3.5 years later. Amongst the 4 battery ranks was young 25-year-old Melbourne motor mechanic Harry Wilson. In an exchange of fire, he continued to man his gun during a savage Turkish counter-bombardment. Even when seriously wounded by shrapnel, he stayed at his post and he continued firing. His actions earned him a mention in dispatches, and he was one of the first recipients of the new military medal for bravery. But this bravery also cost him his left leg. League-level footballer, 22-year-old Sid Taylor, whom everyone called Mick, was a valuable addition to the ranks of 8 Battery. He joined up with his brother Phil, who was also allocated to the artillery. Mick rose too quickly through the ranks and was a gun sergeant on Gallipoli. When his gun was hit by a Turkish 75mm shell, help arrived and rushed to his aid. "Never mind about me, I'm only scratched," he said. He was more concerned with his detachment than himself. Gunner Doug Barrett Leonard was Mick's number 2. He just celebrated his 21st birthday and he wouldn't see 22. The round had shattered his thigh and his arm, and he succumbed to his injuries later that night. The number 3, Stan Carter, a drapier from Fremantle, had his back torn away and was in terrible agony right up until he died. He was more concerned about the damage to his gun and not his wounds. He was buried alongside one of the main tracks leading towards the front line. With his mate, Doug Barrett Leonard, laid to rest nearby. Mick Taylor survived the blast, and the scratch he referred to was the loss of a leg. He was later awarded the military medal for his actions on the peninsula. Phil Taylor, Mick's brother, got knocked and was killed on the Western Front. The Turkish counter-attack was ever-present danger, and the gunners were not likely to let their beloved guns fall into enemy hands. One night, 7 batteries in such a fight only fought off the enemy by firing shrapnel rounds, set to detonate soon after leaving the barrel. This mowed down the massed enemy attack, and at first light the gunners could admire their handiwork, with pellet-ridden bodies and pieces of bodies scattered across the battlefield, a mere 25 metres in front of the gun barrels. Major Gus Hughes, the battery commander of 7 batteries, surveyed the carnage inflicted by his guns and ushered a one-word expletive under his breath, which said it all. That scene would haunt him for years to come. A similar scene confronted a group of gunners in South Vietnam 53 years later on, and this was at a fire support base named Coral. Gunner signallers were kept busy so as to repair the broken telephone cables. This was vital in order to keep the communications open between the observers and the guns. If comms failed, the SIGs then ran the gauntlet of Turkish sniper fire to deliver the corrections and fire orders by hand. Their life expectancy was measured in mere minutes and hours, as they were a prime target for the Turks. Just ask 19-year-old gunner George Fox or bombardier Percy Hopewell, 19, both of whom gave their lives at Gallipoli. As the Anzac front stalled, it was decided to throw additional resources at the British sector further to the south at Hellers. The 2nd Australian Infantry Brigade were re-embarked at Anzac and landed at Hellers. The Australian and Kiwi batteries, still yet to be landed at Anzac, were also diverted to support the 2nd Brigade. Their mission was to capture the strategic town of Karifa. The attack was launched on 6 May and a total failure and cost of hundreds of lives. These losses were not confined to the infantry. The gunners also suffered, as the observer parties were right alongside their gravel crusher mates. The saddest part was on day one, Karifa was undefended and ripe for the taking, and one British officer even walked down the main street, totally unhindered. But the British High Command failed to exploit the situation and seize the opportunity to hold and defend this key terrain. Helles was far better terrain for the artillery, as a wider and deeper beachhead gave more room to manoeuvre. The fields of observation were much better for the gunners, who could observe the Turkish front lines and beyond. The only problem was the Turks had just as good a view of the British and Australian positions and wreaked just as much carnage. Australians, both infantry and gunner alike, are represented in almost every cemetery at Helles. Men such as Captain Rob Crocker, 27, 35-year-old Sid Aubrey, Perce Gibbs and Henry King, both 20, and Major John Mills, 45. All lay at rest in the lush soil, shaded by jacaranda trees and olive trees. It's heartbreaking to realise that these diggers are rarely visited, as their cemeteries are often overshadowed by the more popular battlefields of Anzac. Back in the main Australian front, 2 8-battery guns were dragged by over 160 men into a position just short of a skyline of the 400 plateau. In the first 2 days' fighting, they suffered 22 casualties. The guns were now to be used on a specific mission to take out some troublesome Turkish defences being constructed to their front. The battery commander, Major Alfred Bessel-Brown, already a seasoned and highly decorated soldier following 2 tours of duty in the Boer War, crawled forward and peered over the top at the unsuspecting Turks. He realised that given the position of his guns and the short engagement range of less than 400 yards, he'd have to move them forward and engage with the targets with direct fire. Bessel-Brown briefed his 2 detachment commanders, Sergeant James Braidwood and Sergeant W.D. Wallace, both farmers from Western Australia. Back at the guns, 18-year-old gunner Merv Hobbs wiped a final smear of oil over the breech of his 18-pounder. His dad, Colonel Hobbs, was in command of all Australian artillery at Gallipoli, and the guns were now ready. The plan was for the infantry to open up with prolonged rifle fire, and then the detachments, supported by additional artillery, would drag the guns forward to the forward infantry trenches, where they would pour as many rounds as possible into the Turks, then pull the guns back to their original pits before the enemy could retaliate. Bessel-Brown looked at his watch. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go. Braidwood and Wallace performed brilliantly, both earning military medals for bravery, and got their guns into position within minutes. They then started firing. The Turks were caught totally off guard, and at the given time, Bessel-Brown gave the order to cease firing and to withdraw. Reaching their original positions, the gunners quickly passed line and got their guns ready for action. As the smoke cleared, orders came down from higher via Hobbs to repeat the action. Bessel-Brown questioned the order, which he believed was foolish and unnecessary. This time, the Turkish artillery was ready for them and retaliated with a savage bombardment. With moistened eyes, Colonel Hobbs looked through his binoculars, knowing that his son and his mates were on the receiving end of the bombardment. In these few short minutes, it is impossible to tell every story, but to sum it up with a brief chapter which I concluded in early May 15, that during the Gallipoli campaign, 879 Australian artillerymen were wounded in action, whilst 109 were lost. Our fallen gunners now occupy their own pieces of ground in almost every cemetery, from Helles to Suvla. But what's the greatest lesson we can take away from this presentation? A little over 2 weeks ago, we couldn't pick up a paper, switch on the TV, or listen to a radio without hearing of the pride of our Anzac landings 100 years ago. But as of the 27th, it was hard to find anything within any of the media. What we need to remember that every day between now and 20 December, there is a 100th anniversary, whether indeed in action or in loss, of brave Australian soldiers at Gallipoli. Now, more than ever, is a time that we need to remember. Ubique, lest we forget.